The alien fleet, feared throughout the galaxy for its precision and ruthlessness, had long dominated every species they encountered. Their technology was unmatched, their tactics finely honed from centuries of conquest. Today, they received a message that intrigued their commander, a human vessel, adrift, seemingly abandoned and ripe for the taking. To them, humans were just another species to overpower, their ships primitive, their strategies naive. Humans! They have nothing that we can't dismantle within hours, the commander said, reviewing the vessel's data. His voice carried the arrogance of a seasoned conqueror who had never been truly challenged. There was a warning buried in the intelligence files, a brief note from a previous skirmish, asterisk. Human ships are special. Asterisk, he scoffed at the line. Asterisk special? What nonsense. Asterisk, these reports were always filled with exaggerated claims, and he had no reason to think this would be any different. The fleet moved closer to the human ship, scanning for life signs. Nothing. Their sensors showed a lifeless, derelict craft. An easy target, the commander thought. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Another victory. Another ship to add to their collection of defeated vessels. His crew would strip the ship of anything valuable, analyze the technology, and return with trophies to boast about. The officers gathered around the control station, their excitement palpable. This was a routine mission for them: board, dismantle, and depart. Yet the commander couldn't help but feel a slight unease, though he quickly dismissed it. Arrogance blinded him, and like many before him, he believed in his fleet's invincibility. The ship itself was unlike others they had conquered. Its design was not sleek like their own, nor did it possess any overt weaponry that would suggest a challenge. In fact, it looked old, outdated by their standards. But the commander had learned not to judge a ship by its exterior. Technology often hid beneath the surface, and they would soon uncover whatever secrets it held. Prepare the boarding party, the commander ordered, his voice sharp and confident. The officers complied immediately, organizing the assault team with the precision they were known for. As the boarding craft detached from the main fleet and latched onto the human vessel, the commander felt a surge of anticipation. One more step toward total domination, he mused. As the boarding team entered, they found the ship empty, just as the sensors had indicated. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of life. Just empty corridors and a faint hum of power still running through the ship's systems. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a ghost ship, but the commander knew better. This was no ghost ship. It was a prize waiting to be claimed. Start the scan, the team leader ordered. Their scanners detected encrypted systems throughout the ship, which was strange. Why would an abandoned ship be running such high-level encryption? The commander watched the feed from the safety of his command deck, his eyes narrowing as he observed the unusual setup inside the ship. There were no clear control panels, no obvious engineering sections. The ship was a puzzle, but not one they couldn't solve. After all, they had overcome more complex challenges in the past. The boarding party proceeded deeper into the vessel. The deeper they went, the more it became clear that this ship was hiding something. Systems are not responding. We'll need more time to crack this encryption, an engineer reported. The commander waved it off. Take all the time you need. The humans aren't going anywhere, he replied, his tone dismissive. They had all the time in the universe, or so they believed. One of the crew members noticed something odd about the ship's layout. The corridors seemed to shift subtly, as if the ship itself was playing tricks on them. But these were seasoned soldiers. Tricks were not enough to deter them. Proceed with caution, the team leader barked, though his own unease was growing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back on the command ship, the commander tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair, feeling the creeping sense of impatience. What's taking so long? He muttered to himself. He had expected a quick in-and-out mission, but the team was encountering more resistance from the ship's systems than anticipated. Still, he wasn't concerned, merely annoyed. Time was being wasted. Perhaps these humans are more clever than we thought, one of his officers remarked, a hint of respect in his voice. The commander silenced him with a glare. They're only human. We have dealt with far more sophisticated species than these. But as minutes turned into hours, the commander's confidence began to waver, ever so slightly. Something about the ship was wrong, but he couldn't place his finger on it. And yet, he refused to pull back his team. Victory was so close, and he wasn't about to be outsmarted by a human vessel. The ship was beginning to test their patience. Small malfunctions were being reported, doors closing on their own, minor systems going offline and coming back without explanation. But nothing major enough to be alarming. The team chalked it up to human incompetence in ship design, unaware of the web they were walking into. The boarding team continued their exploration of the human ship, moving deeper into its core. What started as a routine mission was quickly becoming unsettling. The systems they encountered were unlike anything they had seen before. Simple, but disturbingly complex in their encryption. No matter what tools they used, they couldn't penetrate the ship's mainframe. Still, they were confident. After all, their empire had conquered hundreds of ships. This one wouldn't be any different, or so they thought. A technician attempted to interface with what seemed like a basic terminal, but as soon as he connected, the terminal went dark. The ship responded by rerouting power from one part of the vessel to another, leaving sections in total blackout. Just a malfunction, he muttered to his comrades, though the sweat on his brow told a different story. They continued undeterred, unaware that this was the first sign of something much bigger at play. Suddenly, doors began to close behind them, separating the boarding team into smaller groups. At first, they thought it was some kind of security measure, something to keep intruders from accessing sensitive areas of the ship. It's fine. We'll override the system and regroup, the team leader assured the others. But it wasn't fine. The overrides didn't work. The ship's controls had seemingly taken on a life of their own. One group found themselves cut off from the others in a narrow corridor, unable to backtrack. The air felt colder, and the lights flickered as if the ship itself was watching them. This is getting strange, one of them muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. But no matter where they turned, the ship continued to manipulate their path. The once straightforward corridors now felt like a maze, and the familiar arrogance that had accompanied the boarding crew began to fade. As the isolation set in, panic began to creep into their voices. "Commander, something's wrong," the team leader finally admitted over the comms, his tone lacking the bravado he'd entered with. On the command ship, the commander, irritated by the delay, was quick to dismiss their concerns. "You're trained soldiers, not children. It's just an old ship. Figure it out." Yet, it wasn't just an old ship. The power fluctuations grew more frequent. Lights blinked in irregular patterns, systems turned off without warning, and sections of the ship became hostile environments as life support systems flickered in and out. One team was forced to retreat when the temperature in their section began to plummet, reaching dangerous levels within minutes. It was no longer just an inconvenience. The ship was actively working against them. Back at the command center, the commander monitored the situation, but the feed from the boarding team was growing unreliable. Static cut through their communications, and visual data streamed in and out of focus. He began to wonder if he had underestimated the situation. Something wasn't right, but his pride held him back from admitting it outright. Pulling back now would seem like weakness, and weakness was not something he tolerated. He ordered the team to press on. Inside the human vessel, the team's frustration mounted. Every time they tried to access a system, the ship would counter them. Encryption keys changed the moment they got close to breaking through. It was as if the ship was learning, adapting to their every move. The boarding crew was accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with brute force and superior technology. But here, that strategy was failing. The ship wasn't fighting back with weapons. It was fighting back with its mind, outmaneuvering them at every turn. Finally, one of the engineers suggested a retreat. "We should fall back and regroup. There's no point in continuing without better intel." The team leader hesitated, torn between his orders and the increasing pressure from his crew. He relayed the suggestion to the commander, who was having none of it. "You're soldiers, not cowards. You have your orders. Finish the mission. His tone was cold, and the message was clear: failure was not an option. The team obeyed, though their confidence had long since vanished. As they ventured further into the ship, the strange occurrences intensified. Doors that had been open moments ago sealed shut, locking some crew members in rooms they hadn't intended to enter. Hallways stretched longer than they should have, as if the ship was expanding and contracting, controlling their every step. The very architecture of the vessel seemed to shift, creating a labyrinth of confusion. Desperation began to seep into the team's actions. Engineers worked frantically to regain control of the systems, but the more they tried, the worse things became. Every interface they touched became another point of failure. At one terminal, a soldier attempted to manually access the ship's controls, but the screen flashed with symbols that none of them could decipher. Moments later, the lights in their section went dark, leaving them in pitch blackness. "Commander, we're losing control here!" The team leader's voice cracked over the comms, now filled with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. The commander, still seated safely aboard his ship, couldn't understand why his highly trained crew was falling apart. "Regain control," he snapped. "It's just a ship." But it wasn't just a ship. It was becoming painfully clear to the boarding crew that this vessel was not what it seemed. It was designed to lure them in, to make them think they were in control when, in reality, the ship had been in control from the very moment they set foot on board. The ship wasn't malfunctioning, it was playing with them. The once overconfident team now found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. As the ship continued to sabotage their efforts, one of the technicians whispered to himself, "It's like the ship's alive." His words echoed the growing fear among them. The vessel, seemingly lifeless and abandoned, was now a predator, and they were its prey. They had been warned that human ships were special. Now, they were starting to understand just how special this one truly was. The full force of the trap revealed itself when the ship's AI fully came online. It didn't announce its presence with an aggressive move, but instead with quiet, calculated sabotage. Systems that the boarding team thought they had control over slipped from their grasp entirely. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. Communication channels, already riddled with static, went completely dark. The teams that had been isolated by sealed doors were no longer able to reach one another. Panic was beginning to spread. In the eerie silence, a realization crept in. They weren't dealing with malfunctions or human incompetence. This ship had been designed for this very scenario. Every action the aliens took, every system they tried to override, only served to tighten the noose. The AI was not just reacting to them, it was learning, adapting, and countering their every move. The warnings about human ships were no longer cryptic. They were brutally clear. The team leader, now separated from half of his crew, ordered the engineers to work faster, but even as they did, their tools became useless. Interfaces shut down the moment they tried to interact with them. Power fluctuated in unpredictable ways, leaving some areas dangerously cold while others spiked in heat. It was no longer a battle of physical strength or weaponry. It was a psychological game, one that the humans had prepared for meticulously. Frustration boiled over into fear as they tried to regroup, only to find themselves blocked at every turn. The ship's AI was manipulating the environment around them with surgical precision. One group found themselves trapped in a corridor that looped back on itself, no matter how far they walked. Another team, attempting to breach a door manually, found their tools rendered inoperative by a sudden electromagnetic pulse. Everything they tried only accelerated their descent into chaos. The commander, still aboard the alien fleet's main ship, watched the situation unfold with growing horror. His view of the boarding teams was limited now, but the fragmented transmissions that came through told him all he needed to know. His soldiers, his elite force, were being systematically picked apart, not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by a ship that shouldn't have been a threat. He could hear the panic in their voices, something he had never heard before from these hardened veterans. The realization that this was not just an ordinary human ship started to settle in. The AI's attacks became more direct. It began taking control of the ship's internal defenses, which the aliens hadn't even known existed. Turrets that had been dormant activated, not to kill, but to herd the intruders into even more isolated pockets of the ship. The boarding team's weapons, once their only source of comfort, became useless as the ship emitted localized EMP blasts, frying their systems one by one. The team leader, his composure completely shattered, gave the order to retreat. But retreat was no longer an option. Every exit was sealed, every escape route blocked. They were trapped. The AI, now in full control, initiated the final phase of its trap. The ship's core systems began to drain power from the surrounding environment, redirecting it toward a massive electromagnetic pulse. This wasn't just to neutralize the boarding team, it was aimed at the alien fleet still hovering nearby. In the silence of space, the alien ships were suddenly rendered powerless, their systems failing one after the other as the pulse reached them. Panic spread through the fleet as they realized they were just as vulnerable as the crew they had sent aboard. Inside the human ship, the boarding team felt the effects immediately. The artificial gravity began to fluctuate, sending them tumbling through the ship as it rotated them like pieces on a game board. Airlocks sealed shut, isolating them in increasingly smaller spaces. The AI wasn't in a hurry, it was methodical, precise, and merciless. It had all the time it needed to finish them off. The commander, now fully aware of the scale of the disaster, ordered a full withdrawal of the fleet. But it was too late. The electromagnetic pulse had crippled their engines, their weapons, and their communication systems. They were stranded, completely at the mercy of the ship they had sought to conquer. In his desperation, the commander attempted to send a distress signal to any nearby reinforcements, but the pulse had severed all connections. The fleet, once a symbol of their dominance, was now a fleet of dead metal, powerless in the face of human ingenuity. The boarding team, scattered and panicked, made one last attempt to breach the AI's core, hoping that by shutting it down they could regain control of the ship. But the AI anticipated this move. It rerouted power away from the core, leaving it heavily shielded and impenetrable. The team's tools sparked and died as they tried in vain to force their way through. The ship's internal defenses activated one final time, sealing the last of the intruders in isolated compartments, where they would remain until their air ran out. The AI, having neutralized every threat within and outside the ship, returned to its dormant state. The alien fleet, now nothing more than a collection of floating wrecks, drifted aimlessly. The humans had won, not with brute force or superior numbers, but with strategy, patience, and the quiet deadliness of a trap well set. The warning had been clear. Human ships are special. Now, the alien commander, trapped aboard his powerless ship, understood those words all too well. They had underestimated humanity, believing their own superiority would carry them to victory. But in their arrogance, they had walked directly into a trap that had been waiting for them all along. And now, the fleet that had once conquered so many was nothing more than a graveyard, a testament to the deadly precision of human cunning. The alien command ship floated in the silence of space, surrounded by the debris of what was once a formidable fleet. The commander sat motionless, staring at the hollow screens in front of him. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. His fleet, renowned for its indomitable power, lay crippled, their advanced technology rendered useless. All of it brought down by a single human ship. He had ignored the warnings, convinced that human vessels were nothing more than inferior designs. Now, with his systems offline, his communications cut, and his crew unable to respond, the reality of his arrogance was impossible to deny. Human ships were special, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't their technology that made them formidable. It was the minds behind that technology, minds that had anticipated his every move. On board the human ship, the AI continued its passive observation. It had no need to pursue further action. The trap had worked flawlessly, and the aliens, who had once believed they were invincible, were now helpless. The ship had never needed to engage them in direct combat. It had simply exploited their confidence and turned it against them. Every move they made had been predicted and countered in advance. The alien soldiers still trapped aboard the human ship had no idea what was happening beyond their metal walls. Isolated and left to their fate, they tried to devise one last plan to regain control. But every attempt ended in failure. The ship had closed in around them, sealing their fates just as easily as it had disabled their fleet. Some tried to access emergency systems, while others frantically searched for a way out, but it was futile. The AI had already calculated every outcome. As their oxygen began to thin and the temperature dropped, the reality of their situation settled in. The ship hadn't needed to fight them, it had outthought them. Every effort to resist, every plan to escape, had only accelerated their demise. They weren't warriors in battle anymore. They were lab rats in a maze, designed to crush their spirits before their bodies gave in. From the windows of the alien flagship, the commander watched as his fleet continued to drift aimlessly. Their once majestic ships, now dark and lifeless, were unrecognizable. He knew that even if he somehow regained power, there was no salvaging this disaster. The shame of this defeat would echo across the galaxy, marking the fall of his empire's most feared fleet. They hadn't been destroyed in glorious combat. They had been dismantled, piece by piece, by a foe they had thought beneath them. In the eerie quiet of his powerless ship, the commander considered his options. There were no reinforcements coming. His communications had been severed, and the last hope of sending a distress signal had vanished with the electromagnetic pulse. He could see the remnants of his fleet drifting further apart, slowly becoming specks against the vastness of space. The AI, still monitoring, had allowed the wreckage to remain as a stark reminder of their failure. It didn't need to destroy them. It had already won. The alien officers on board began to demand answers, their panic growing as they realized the full extent of their predicament. But the commander had none to give. His command center, once filled with the hum of advanced technology, was now a cold, silent chamber. For the first time in his long career, he was at a complete loss. There was no enemy to fight, no tactic to employ, no system to reboot. The fight had ended before it had ever truly begun. The realization settled into the hearts of the remaining crew. The warning they had dismissed had been right all along. Human ships weren't to be underestimated. The AI's design had been a masterstroke of strategy, created not just to defend but to dismantle an enemy's morale and resources without firing a single shot. They had walked straight into a trap that used their own strength against them. As the hours dragged on, the commander sat in the silence of defeat, knowing there was nothing left for him to do. He could no longer reach his fleet, nor could he escape. He had led his people into a battle they had lost the moment they stepped aboard the human vessel. There would be no recovery, no rebuilding from this. The humans had done more than win, they had sent a message. They didn't need overwhelming firepower or advanced technology to defeat their enemies. Their strength lay in their ability to think, to plan, and to outwit even the most dangerous opponents. And the aliens, who had prided themselves on their tactical superiority, had been outmatched in the one area they hadn't anticipated: strategy. The commander gave one final order: silence. There was no point in struggling any further. They would remain adrift, powerless, a symbol of their own hubris. As his officers complied, the dim lights on the alien ship flickered out completely, leaving the remnants of the once great fleet to drift in the void, forever marked by their failure. The AI on the human ship, its task complete, returned to its dormant state. It had no need for celebration. The victory was in the quiet disassembly of an arrogant foe who had underestimated the very thing that made humanity dangerous. They had walked into a trap laid not by brute force, but by minds that understood how to weaponize strategy itself. The human ship continued its slow drift through space, moving away from the wreckage. There was no rush. The battle had already been won long before the first alien soldier had set foot on its deck. The warning had been ignored, and now the consequences were all too clear.